everyone. We'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Bickerton, who will be lecturing on e-governance and data. Please join me in welcoming her.
Kia ora koutou, ko Sarah Hendrika Bickerton talking hi everybody, I'm Sarah Bickerton. I'm a lecturer in public policy and also the director of the Master in Public Policy program here at the university. Today we're going to go through e-governance and a bunch of that kind of stuff is actually going to be boring. Okay. Well, not boring in the sense of, well, I think it's interesting because I have to because I research the topic. But more that it's going to focus on everybody gets amazed by e-governance, thinking it's all about the flashy technology. Sorry to burst your bubble, but that's not what this is about. Okay. This is about the way in which we get into technology. And before we get started, I just wanted to do a small blessing here. Tutawa mai ka runga, tutawa mai ka raro, tutawa mai ki roto, tutawa mai ki waro, kaita ai te Māori te Māori ora, ki te katoa home kuie tākie. So, in addition to, I do this before any of these kind of sessions, this kind of leads into what the point is here. We're going to look at the process of doing technology and governance arrangements and how you do that well. Because I got into studying technology as a nerd. Okay, I am a big nerd. And I'm not exaggerating about this, my first degree before I ever got anywhere near the social sciences was astrophysics. My research, yes, so yeah, I am that nerd. Okay, I took like quantum mechanics and linear algebra and high level calculus through to honors level and all this kind of stuff. And that's not to say that boasting. That's just how much of a nerd I am. So I was able to, when I got into the social sciences, because I did a double degree undergrad, because apparently just doing astrophysics wasn't hard enough. I thought, oh, the great way about bringing those two sides together was to look at the place of technology in the social environment, because technology isn't just technology, okay? Technology is embedded in the social, in the cultural, and the different ways we approach things. To say that anyone that doubts this, that thinks that technology is neutral, only has to look at the way in which Europeans developing ocean-going ships allowed them to create colonization around the world. That's a technology that was embedded in practices of the social and the cultural that has massive ramifications. Okay, I don't need to explain that to folks from the Pacific. So thinking about technology, any technology, even if it's as small as a cell phone, you have to go back to the cultural and social values and the things that you want to get done before even leaping forward to a technology. Anyone that shows up at your door as public servants, and this happens all the time, where the technology goes, look, we've got a great technology. You want to immediately think about it, how it embeds in your current structural arrangements and the way in which that operates. So that's the context in which we're going to be operating in here today. And that's what I want you to think about. Because you're going to have a couple of activities throughout the day, as you usually do, where you're thinking about what current e-governance using technology and the arrangements of your governance frameworks. But I want you to not leave, oh, we need to have this technology in order to do X. Okay? Don't do that. Think about, as a starting point, a step behind that and thinking about what is even the problem here? Okay? Why would we need this? So that's going to be the starting point, and we're going to be doing all these kinds of things. Shockingly, that is about governance. Okay? So when we're thinking about tech, think about it through that lens. So we end up with, what is governance? You guys, how many sessions have they had already so far? Oh, one. Okay, so you would have had a discussion around what governance is. But just as a primer, or maybe getting back to a primer, it's more than just government. It's the various ways in which social life is coordinated. Okay? It includes government, but it's thinking about it through what social life, cultural life, the structures of your society, and the way in which that operates. Think about, and you can already start thinking about technology in that lens, because like, who gets access to technology? What does it get used through different structures, the way in which your society operates, is as fundamental to the success of an e-governance project as the technology itself. Thinking about it as being embedded in the networks of your society. Okay? So, I think of e-governance as the intersection of values, technology, and provision. Okay, so values is obviously the structures that you're in. The technology is it's the shiny little thing that you really enjoy. And provision is how do you provide it? And that's also where the arrangement that we talk about comes together. So think about it in that kind of way. By the way, speaking about technology, I recommend you mute all your devices, because if any of your devices make noises, I will answer it. And I've got a terrible sense of humor, so you don't want me answering your devices. So just FYI. Okay. So the major thing is, what is the gap and why? Okay. Think about it that way. What is the gap? And by gap, I don't necessarily mean what is missing, but also think about it as like, if we were filling that gap, what would it take? Okay. Do you even have the capacity to fill that gap? The mere fact that a gap exists does not necessarily mean you need technology to do it, or that it necessarily needs to be immediately filled. Okay. So this is what I'm saying about when you're thinking about these tech in public policy and governance frameworks. Shockingly, locate yourself in the public and contextualize everything that way. Yes, this is boring. Okay, this is basic governance questions that you're asking yourself before you even get to the technology. But as we will discuss as we go further on through the session, not considering that has some major ramifications. Okay, so some examples. You guys have got slides, so you'll already know some of the examples. E-voting is a classic example. We're going to get onto that and why almost universally that's a bad idea. Okay. But that one's one that pops up. But then there's things like e-participation, which actually is one of the major areas in which we do a lot of, we can actually provide for a lot of technology provision for that. That in New Zealand, that often works in terms of people submitting on bills online. The one thing a lot of people don't realize is that 2025 was a record-breaking year in New Zealand for parliamentary submissions. Okay, we have never seen a year like 2025 was for 2024 leading into 2025. It was huge. It actually there was a couple of bills that were so big and submitted, so many people submitted on. It actually overloaded our servers in Wellington and actually called the entire system to go down. That's a simpler thing as being able to submit on a bill. But there's also the ability to provide feedback, to contribute. One of my favorite things goes from e-participation into co-production was a lot of city councils in New Zealand have an app. And if you spot something like broken water main, a curb that's fallen apart, a tree that's fallen down, or something like that, you can take a photo with the app, tag it with its GPS location, and within the app it goes to the council. Because I know this may be a shocker to some people, but councils can't be everywhere at the same time. And so having the public be able to go, oh, okay, yeah, this is here, and be able to be a part of co-production or co-provision of services is actually like really simple things like that. Doesn't have to be complex. You don't need to be able to do all of the city government functions in the app. But and that doesn't even need to be an app. It could just literally just be a website where you do that kind of basic functionality. So service delivery, decision making, collaboration, that's another one of the big ones where you might be giving feedback on something, you may be signing up to be part of a focus group. Oh, they may distribute documents to you about like as like a street change or that kind of stuff. These are all really basic and again, boring things that is the everyday part of governance that you can involve technology with. But when you're understanding this stuff, you've got to say, okay, what's the provision of services like? One of the things that we particularly ran into when COVID hit in New Zealand was that there was a rapid transition between like traditional ways of learning, particularly in education, and online learning. Now, what happened was we found very quickly that this happened better for richer families and happened worse for lower socioeconomic families because of the way in which technology was embedded in those kind of arrangements. What we found is that in higher socioeconomic families and communities and stuff, each of the family members would have a device. Okay, often it would be a computer. Okay, in a lot of lower socioeconomic communities, there'd be maybe one device. It was like maybe a computer for the family. And then if anybody had any devices, it would be something like a smartphone, maybe a tablet. But that was one of the major things. So you had one device that the whole family had to use. And so understanding the way in which we do that kind of service delivery mediated through, yes, we can switch to online service provision of education when the pandemic hit. But understanding the way in which that was embedded in social arrangements meant that there's a whole communities of kids that have missed 2 to 3 years of schooling because they weren't able to have that kind of provision. But that doesn't mean, oh, suddenly let's put in a program that we give computers to all of lower socioeconomic groups. Okay, brand new computer is great, but you've got to do a whole bunch of things with it. You've got to set it up. Okay, you've got to maintain it. What happens if it screws up? Okay, because shockingly, computers don't always work the best all the time. And who in a lower socioeconomic community may be educated in running a VPN on the computer so they can access school services, and those kind of things. Although coming from a high socioeconomic background myself, I'm going to say my parents were great with VPNs anyway, but that's a different discussion. It can involve things like digitization of government services, okay, which is great. And it's a thing that a lot of governments actually strive for, that digitization of government services is a big goal. And I'm going to say that probably is a good goal to have. But the trouble is, what happens when we go into a money-starved government arrangement is that costs less than in-person provision of government services. So what you'll have is a reduction in in-person government services to save money because you've got this digitization provision. But there are whole sectors of the community where that doesn't serve. Okay, you can think about old people. Okay, people that aren't digitally literate and so on. So that, even though we can all agree that that's kind of a good thing, that's something we want to be able to do, it doesn't serve everyone. Also, it assumes everyone has the same internet access. Okay, so again, this is what I'm talking about, like the boring stuff about the provision of these services. You've got to do the scope mapping before you even get remotely near the technology. Okay, and one of the very boring things, if most people here have got a laptop of some kind, how many of you that's your personal laptop? Oh, that's cool. Okay, we've got a few. That's personal. For the majority of you, it's the one that you got provided through work, right? Okay, yeah. So, public service ICT involves a lot of that. And that's the bulk of experience when it comes to dealing with e-governance is, how do we provide technology to the people in the government service? And how do we do that? How do we manage that? How do we provide those kind of services? And this is what I talk about with, we can be really like, oh, technology is nice, but that's the boring stuff. But that's the stuff where the provision, the arrangement, the servicing, the way in which, there's one thing I often use when I talk about provision of ICT is what I term the 80-20 rule. Generally, with a lot of provision of ICT, it'll do about 80%. When they provide you something, it'll be 80% ready. They'll rely on a lot the public service workers to do the other 20%. They'll offload all the things. Oh, we'll give that to you and you can work out the rest of it. You have to provide for it, et cetera, et cetera. And so that kind of, it'll provide 80% of the solution, but you've got to do 20% of the work to just make it work well for you. That's what a lot of private sector provision is operating under. So that's where it can get boring. Okay, so what we're going to do is, that's a contextualization of what thinking about technology provision. So y'all are in really nice little groups. So what, and I suspect that's totally random and you're not just sitting with people you know. What I want you guys to go through over the next 20 minutes is, what do you think e-governance is? What is an example from your own country you can think of? Now, don't think of a good example. Well, you can think of one that's worked absolutely amazing. But the interesting thing, the thing that you learn from are the ones that didn't work well. Or the ones that kind of worked, but there were other things that you needed to do. So think about it in that kind of, that for some of you that may be really easy, that nothing's gone really well. For some of you that might be a little bit hard, everything may have gone swimmingly. But think about like an example of e-governance, the embedding of technology in the practice of governance, that in your own country that's worked well, or maybe you're in the middle of, that you're thinking, okay, we've got to project forward and get some stuff organized. So we'll do that for about 20 minutes and we'll come back at 37 past the hour and start having some chats and getting some report backs. Okay, I'll circle around you guys. Pick somebody to take some notes so that someone can actually report back. Okay, so sweet. Take a few minutes.
Because we I'm like they call me an old generation. So I kind of relate to a lot of what you said. Not technically, no,
Yeah.
I have a lot of concerns about these.
Yeah.
That's why I don't know.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've been through a chunk of ICT provision and seen it a lot through a lot of government as well. So I've seen good examples. So do you mind me asking, okay, cool. Okay, yeah, this is what I figured would happen. We jumped like
I also
yeah,
take that.
yeah. Do you guys are you all for the same cards and government or okay, cool. So instead of may I shifting that to an area of yours, or that you're having like organizations working together on a similar project or something like that. One that can require a lot of collaboration between government sectors and that kind of thing. That's the one. Thanks so much. Because different departments and different ministries have their own ways of communicating. And that's not just about practice, it's also just something like what data is used. And like if you've got a data set, how does it work with data set from another But think about like some places divisions, rolling. That each worked on and what might have worked well, didn't work well, where do you think the gaps are?
They actually
Yeah.
It's not really and also they also but also yes, like So it's one sort of houses island, cook is the
Useful.
Yeah.
You can do everything. We don't.
Since we're not doing options, and it's in us. To find out what things are saying,
So demand, regularly.
Yeah. So now it's
Document for one person?
Yeah.
Which used to share.
the same But he's
Hopeful arrangement.
And then for access.
What would be the case in the station? They can see.
But.
Yeah, my God, yeah, that's the best thing about
But yeah,
It's a website that you can link all people
like the clay. Yeah.
and then like there are a bunch of different digital services provided, and do they communicate?
But I try it's like as we don't.
Yeah.
We don't know how to do things around there, then, but the information. It takes months. Like when you plan your video to travel to. Oh. Yeah.
It's not easy to use.
Yeah. Just it's not really.
Not user friendly. That's one problem, like, especially if we kind of have the wider door.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if it's internet sample.
That's how you register.
So like currently we get samples of we don't use it like this.
Yeah, you know when the relation relationship
Well,
Kita kan ada yang
They put on.
Yes. We ran the other guys, they get the whole.
We've had. Those that have seen it. Because they're often run by the private entities, a lot of money, so they're. Yeah. Yes. So you put for the station. So, and then another thing. Even with I think so. Oh yeah, no, this is I've got a waste. Now, I'm saying they start to but
I cannot use the.
so it's not that they have access to it. You're getting to that. One thing I know is another one and that kind of stuff. It's not just it has to apply for it for it. Like it's you can't just here and say.
Hard, but which it's fair enough.
Right, I think you might.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
This is time with the
But luckily there will be a video. Yes. But, that. Some government. Yes, the silo is aspect of it. So, I was thinking about this the other day. I took a break from here for a short while. A while ago now. And I didn't find sort of one of the banks here in New Zealand. And I was able to see where we were, reference, identification systems. So it's like how so I did and you can gang on it.
It's ridiculous.
Driver's license name, and often your title on to leave your will be on your ID. But having the name. And now if the Ministry of Pacific Hills and to Treasury, and they were saying, they could do some major changes. And people doing this, we're like, oh, okay, yes, I can understand why the differences. But this is how we go. Consumption. They do major shift. Oh, major. Yeah, so that's the kind of things that like thinking about, not just in terms of like when the social companies. So do you guys, I know that you both have digitalization services and that kind of stuff, but do they? One industry talk to another and another industry. They do this in good morning. Okay, anyway, we'll bring it back. Okay, everybody, sweet. Because I was talking too much, I ended up running a little bit over time. How about we just do some quick examples from a few of the groups? Since I started talking to you guys first, how about, does anybody want to volunteer for 5 seconds?
So I would discuss governance in terms of digitizing government services,
Yeah.
specifically our online system for business registries.
Oh, where are you from?
Tom.
Yeah.
So business registry has an online system for registering businesses.
Yeah.
So what we discussed is that the benefit of that is it's less cost for public. The fee has been reduced by 50%, so that's good for our customers. But then it also it's a fast process. You upload everything, you get your registration approved, and you get your license within 24 hours. But the downside would be there's a possibility of having forged documents uploaded online. But also, it doesn't cover everyone.
No.
Those that are not computer literate
Yeah,
still have to come by to the office to register, so that defeats the purpose of going online.
Yeah.
But we also discussed the fact that we didn't have a transition period to go from, to still use manual while.
right, yeah.
We just went straight from fully manual to
Fully digital?
online.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, we, to this day, we still have people coming in for, assistance from our staff.
Yeah.
So that kind of like defeats the purpose of going online.
Yeah, does the business registrar that you registration, what department is that ran out of?
Ministry of Trading. not
Ministry of
one.
Training. Does, other government departments get access to that registration portal? Or is it just for that ministry?
It's for the public.
For the public,
Yeah,
oh,
the
okay.
public can just go online and,
Okay.
yeah.
No, what I was thinking about, like, the IRD, the or IRS, the Inland Revenue Tax system, do they have access to that business?
No. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that we discussed, like collaboration is.
Yeah.
Gap in the collaboration with specifically the Ministry of Revenue in terms
Yeah.
of tax and.
No, but that's a great example. It's like, I'm just changing my mind and I think we'll just use that as a great example to talk about, like, because you can think about not just the dependencies that were going into setting that up, but then also what the flow on effects of that in terms of connecting to other ministries, what might it be used for, but also like, what are the weak points and that kind of stuff, because, great example. Okay, so we'll rather than going around, I think that we'll use her example, as a good one. Okay, so where did I put my, there we go. Okay, so this will be not too much of a shock. Public service ICT and private sector ICT are two really different things, okay? People often think about the fact that because it's largely the same technology, that, oh, you can just do the same. You can't. And that's about understanding what's particular about the public service, that doing these kind of ICT projects, even if it's not necessarily a public portal like with yours, but there may be something internal that has negative effects or has particular effects because of the public service context. So like one of the things that public service is quite risk averse. You know, it's like and part of that is the fact that in the private sector, you can identify a market that you're going after, and you can target that market and go for that. Okay, you say, okay, we're just not going to service 50-year-olds. Okay, public sector, that doesn't happen. Well, it shouldn't happen. It's about understanding the fact that you have to provide to everybody in society. Okay, and that makes people really risk averse. Possibly overly so in some situations, but rightly so in a lot of situations. There's also legal and formal restrictions around that kind of stuff that you have to deal with that are particular to, now, for good or bad reasons. There's a lot of stuff that, like, thinking about the flow and effects of a decision being made that require these kind of legal and formal processes to mitigate them. ICT is no different. Also, private sector tends to be very nicely hierarchical. Okay, it's like go to a certain person, get approval, boom, you're done. Whereas the public sector often has multiple horizontal authorities. Okay, and so dealing with that and the requirements, and so they'll often all be at the same level, so you can't get an override. So again, that has positive and negatives. But yeah, understanding that, like, and also, this is one of the big ones, that private sector doesn't necessarily have, you've also got political constraints in there. Okay, you've got to deal with not just the provision of services, but provision of services within a political context. Okay, and I know that we can all get really annoyed, but oh, that's politics getting in the way of my work. Politics is democracy. And so while you may get annoyed with politics impinging upon your work, it's also democracy kind of impinging upon your work. So for better or worse, I'm trying to be positive here. Okay? There's multiple stakeholders. And this is why that has ramifications is that understanding all the stakeholders and who they are in terms of stakeholder mapping is one of the primary things that any project regarding ICT has to do right from the beginning, is understanding who's involved. Once you understand who's involved, you can then go to the secondary step of mapping out what their requirements are. Leaping ahead to assuming that everyone else has the same requirements that you do, negates the way in which you've got different stakeholders with different requirements. Okay. And then of course, the siloed nature of the public service. Okay. Short budget cycles. Yeah, this is particularly a problem in New Zealand. Does anybody know how long or short the government, a term of government is in New Zealand?
3 years.
3 years. It's like one of the shortest in the entire world. I'm assuming you guys have longer systems. How many? 4 years? Yeah, 5 years. Okay, these are far more sensible arrangements than what we have in New Zealand. We have 3. There's a reason for why we do 3. But this is not a political theory context. But it does result in very short-term budget cycles. Okay. And so that's often something that you're dealing with. We discussed a context over there where, and I don't have this in a list here, but one of the things that often happens in modern government is that changes such as ICT provision is done through a project model. Okay, so you want to do something, you set up a project to do it, and then once you've completed the project, it then gets embedded in what we do BAU, right? Business as usual. The trouble is, when sometimes the project may not hit all its goals. Okay, and they may say, oh, is it done sufficient enough? Okay, we're closing the project down and we're embedding it in BAU. Now, the trouble with that is if you want to monitor, and this gets back to your point about it's like going wholly on manual to wholly online, is that a lot of the problems that have been set up at the end of the project may not necessarily have additional funding provided as it's slotted into BAU to fix those. Okay. So short budget cycles, complex and regulated procurement processes and different evaluation criteria. I'm a Mac user. I like Apple products. By default at the university, unless you make a specific requirement, we get a PC. Now, a Windows machine. Now, Windows machines are crap. Okay, I'm a Mac user. Superior Apple technology. Luckily, there's been an acceptance that the majority of us that like Macs, we feel kind of strongly about it, and it's now a thing that like we can easily say no, I'd like a Mac when they provide a computer to us. How many of your government departments will provide you a Mac rather than a PC? Zero. No, there are, yeah, so it's exactly the thing. But, and I know that's a rather light-hearted example, but that's the kind of thing that you got those procurement requirements around and different evaluation criteria. I was asking a few of you that were from the same countries because you were from different departments or ministries. Literally things like what you evaluate success on a project differs between different departments and ministries. Sometimes for very good reason. But understanding that this is the challenge that you're operating in has has a very different context to private sector provision. And I know that you guys get that. Okay, I'm not talking to noobs here. But understanding the nature of that difference allows you to do better public sector planning for ICT provision. Okay, so getting the fact that public sector is different is one thing, but understanding the nature of that difference, that's the thing that lets you plan it better. Okay, so what I want to do is a case example. Okay, there's like, anybody heard of NovaPay before? Okay, great. Okay, terrific. This was a disaster. Okay, I'm just going to put that out there. The Ministry of Education in New Zealand is the largest employer in the country. Okay, like by a long shot. Technically, every single teacher in New Zealand is employed, with some small exceptions, is employed by individual schools. That's the way in which it operates in New Zealand. They're actually employed by the school. However, pay, in other words, like the money you get for having a job, comes from the Ministry of Education. So while you're technically employed, like you're hired by a school, you're employed by the Ministry of Education. Okay, and so they were the largest one, and they had one of the major changes that's been happening over the last couple of decades in New Zealand is that we've gone from from old computer systems to second generation computer systems. So it's not just the digitization of services, but it's the second generation of digitization of services. We've had these old computer systems that have been in place through the 80s and the 90s, starting off in the 70s and stuff like this with the basic stuff. And then it's been embedded in the 1980s, moved into the 1990s, and we've started going into the 2000s. And these were old ass systems. Okay, they bolted on things to make them a little bit more responsive and like might have an online communication system and you'd have that computer in the corner with a piece of paper that was taped to it that said, do not turn off this computer because that was one of the, we'll know that computer, that was like a bridge between the old system and the new system. And so Ministry of Education was one of those ones, okay? We had, for the longest time in New Zealand, a lot of the provision of government services, digital services in New Zealand was done through a company called Datacom. If you're an individual consumer, you will have never had any interaction with Datacom. They almost universally provided services to government in some parts. But Datacom almost had a monopoly on a lot of stuff. They had an aging system. It worked, but it had limited provision. Modern employment practices wouldn't work well with it. It wasn't natively online. It just required a lot of work. So this was recognized as we were going into the 2000s that there needed to be a shift. Okay. Now, a small HR company called Talent2 won the contract in 2005. It was shocking. Everybody was a little bit shocked when Talent2 won the contract because Datacom had actually provided an updated service. They said, hey, we have this new system, it worked well. Datacom had been around for a while, but Talent2 got picked. Signed off by Labour Party government in 2008. That was the Helen Clark government. Anybody who's paying attention to New Zealand politics. It was rolled out in 2011, 2012. Okay. Now, first thing that should be a flag for you here, that's 7 years. Okay? That should be an immediate red flag to you guys. I mean, you know, we were just talking about short budget cycles. How many projects that you've been involved that took 7 years to get rolled out? Okay? And that's not even testing after rollout. That's just for provision. So, context. It was taken over, so it got rolled out in 2011, 2012. So it was being run by Talent2 for the Ministry of Education. In 2014, 2 to 3 years later, it got taken over by the Ministry of Education. Okay? Again, that is 9 years. It's almost a decade after it started to have a contract. What was happening was there were massive delays in implementation, errors. But worse than errors was compounding errors. You guys know what a compounding error is? It's an error on top of an error. Yeah. Talent2 suddenly put in and said they offloaded the corrections to individual school staff. Okay, so the administration time to correct, and the trouble was they couldn't keep up with the number of errors that were occurring. And so not only we were getting errors, compounding errors, and then they were offloading that work to individual school staff who had their own jobs to do. They were never able to keep up. So it actually got worse and worse and worse because they could never keep up with the rolling of errors. Flow-on effects, people were overpaid, people were underpaid. The annoying thing was like debt collectors were called in situations of overpayment, even though nobody could correct the overpayment. Funnily enough, if you got underpaid, there was no massive debt collection going on there. Now, also, because of the long period of time here, there was a change of government. We shifted from Labour into National, and Economic Development Minister Stephen Joyce took over in 2013. We'll actually just play this, and it'll be a short clip. And yeah. These gonna work. Should actually work. Okay, we're going to go escape. Where are you? There we go. Do that. How about that? Look at that. I have technology. That is weird. I don't know why that is not playing. Oh, damn. Okay. Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah. There we go. Let's try this again. Yeah. There we go.
Haina mai ngā take I hapa ai te pūnaha utu kai o o Nova Pai. He ai ki te ranga hau I whakahaere hia ai e te runanga minita o te kāwanatanga. Te kaumārima ngā tū tohinga hei aruaru e tika ai te mahi a te pūnaha nei. Hei tā te ranga hau nei nā ngā hapa o Nova Pai kua mimiti te whakapono o te Marea Whānui ki te tarahuhu o te mātauranga. Tuia ki tērā nā te whakahihi o te tarahuhu o te mātauranga, me ono hoa whakahaere pērā ia Talent 2, ka tāia e rātou ngā mōiui o tanga o Nova Pai te rongo wā, ka hapa te pūnaha Nova Pai.
We can confirm for you today that the government intends to act on all those recommendations. The report was considered at Cabinet this morning, and Cabinet authorised me to say that will indeed be the case. The recommendations in relation to the ministry, also the wider public sector, and the other point I think.
Oh, I would not. Yeah.
The first time.
Yeah,
that an ICT project in the public sector has had difficulties, and they were disappointed that a number of the issues that have occurred despite the learnings of past projects, despite the measures that have been put in place since past projects.
E rua te kau mātoru I le kati iwa miliona tāra te nui atu o te pūtea kua pau ia Nova Pai I tā te kāwanatanga I whakatau tuatahi ai. Nō reira kua heke te uara whānui o tēnei pūnahi I naia nei I te 50,000 I le kati 8 miliona tā.
And that's even worse because that's $2013. It's like, I mean, really, it is a big project. Okay, you don't want to be like, again, biggest employer in New Zealand. You want to spend the right amount of money for about $56 million in 2013 for a payroll system. It was really bad. So what went wrong? Now, these are the things that I've gone through. It's in, there should be a copy of the report in the documents that were provided to you guys. I have a quick skim through like this executive summary and that kind of stuff. You don't need to read the whole thing. But it's like, I've read through it and this was some takeaways that I kind of took from like design, like what went wrong. Scoping, understanding the requirements. That was like what was required from the new system that you wanted, not just in terms of new provision of services, but like what does it look like to provide these kind of requirements, not just in terms of the services that it provides, but what's it required to operate on. Okay, diversity. Who is involved in that scoping design? Okay, I can pretty much guarantee you that school administrators in Talent 2 in the Nova Pai example weren't involved, but they are the people that manage a lot of the payroll systems in New Zealand schools. Provision. Can the solution provide? This may seem like a stupid question to ask, but is it providing the basic services? Okay. And what does that look like? Okay. What does provision look like? You may have had a provision before and know what that provision of service looks like under the previous system, but understanding what provision under the new system looks like in comparison, it's really complex. And this is all before contract, by the way. Okay. Change planning. What does it look like? What does the change system look like? Also, how much of that is needed, and is there the capacity to do it? As I mentioned with the example from Nova Pai, suddenly rushing to fix the problems and offloading that onto school administrators to do who didn't have the capacity for it. Sounds like a great solution. Oh, we'll get administrators who are dealing with payroll to deal with payroll errors. That's not capacity. Okay. And so you need to understand, it's like, is there capacity for the change, but is there capacity to deal with the negative ramifications of it if something goes wrong? Timeline, how accurate was it? The timeline from Talent 2 wasn't accurate at all, as you can see for that period of time. Redundancies, and I don't mean redundancy in the sense of people being laid off. I mean, although if it goes badly, maybe it should be. But that thing that you mentioned earlier about going from wholly manual to wholly online, there's no redundancy in that system. It's like one thing's go wrong, there's nothing to fall back on. Okay, there was nothing to fall back on with this, with NovaPay. It was like they flipped the switch, and like on Friday we finished one, and Monday we went on to the new system. That had problems. Dependency. What is the system dependent on? Okay, and so there's a term that we use in studying public policy that's this concept called externalities. Okay, so there are things that the process produces that are not the stuff that you're planning for, but will happen anyway. Okay. And so understanding dependencies in the context of not just what the system's dependent upon, but what are the dependencies on the system operating okay, and the way it's always operated, that by shifting things, it'll have those kind of effects. And that's part of your scoping, okay? And then failure planning, okay? What do you do if things go wrong, okay? What do you do for those externalities? Okay, even if it's working well, it might have negative effects. How do you plan for that and organize that? And again, this is what, getting back to what I said earlier about doing public sector ICT isn't about the technology. Okay, it's about this boring stuff. That to do any government project, you need to have mapped this stuff out before you end up where you're doing. Another piece of work I did when I was not being an academic was I was involved a little while after NovaPay, also in the Ministry of Education, where they're also, in addition to being the biggest employer in the nation, they're also the biggest property owner in New Zealand. So while each of the schools operate independently, the land and buildings that the school has is all owned by the Ministry of Education. So therefore, they have their own land management system. Okay, and shockingly, they had an old computer system. And in the around 2010, 2011, I think, they needed to shift, like 2013, just off the back of the NovaPay debacle. They shifted from this old system of provision for land, for information on buildings and land and all this kind of stuff to a new system. And I thought it really interesting that no one in the Ministry of Education, would mention the N word about this new NovaPay in this new ICT system. They had so many redundancies. They're running the new system alongside the old system every single day. Well, no, multiple times per day. The new system outputted a report, and then the old system got completely updated to match the new system, so that just in case the old system failed, they could switch back to the just in case the new system failed, they could switch back to the old system. They had so many of these things happening that were all set up, and negative effects and stuff like this. So they learned from it. And the thing is, as much as I'm poking fun at NovaPay because that's a classic example, that second rollout for the building assets and land management stuff went without a hitch, because they were able to do all this kind of stuff beforehand, and it was particularly good. They actually did an amazing job about that stuff. So this is the kind of stuff. Anyway, we're going to have a break now. We'll be back in about half an hour, and we'll start getting some other stuff. I got to sit in the air conditioning for 10 minutes, and so I am thoroughly recharged. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into some examples of the setting up of that framework I was talking about earlier, about thinking about the context in which you're operating. and what might be the impacts of our particular technology when it gets implemented. So this is a longer video. So like I won't play all of it because otherwise we end up having the whole day here. Which I'm sure you guys would love to have an entire day of me, but no, we'll go with that. I am wonderful. I don't know what you guys are talking about. But if you want, for instance, why electronic voting is still a bad idea, look that up on YouTube and you can see the whole thing. But we'll go into a little bit at the beginning, and it talks about, he does what we talked about earlier, about situating the technology within the social arrangements that it's in. So have a think about that kind of stuff as we go forward a little bit.
5 years ago, I made a video for a channel called Computer File about why electronic voting is a bad idea. And I still get emails occasionally asking, things must have changed by now, right? There's this new idea and maybe it'll help. Surely electronic voting is just around the corner. No, it's really not. Here is why electronic voting is still a bad idea. Elections have some very unusual requirements. There are two key features that are almost opposed to each other: anonymity and trust. So first, your vote should be completely anonymous. There should be no way that anyone can find out who you voted for, even after everything's been counted. That way, no one can bribe you or threaten you to vote a particular way. In the UK, if you mark your ballot in a way that could potentially identify you, so if you sign it, for example, then that ballot is not counted. This is why election officials are worried about people taking selfies with their ballots, because you should not be able to prove how you voted afterwards. Otherwise, you can have a tax like $10 off for blue voters, or entry to this party only for yellow voters, or vote red or you'll regret it. Votes have to be anonymous. The second requirement is absolute transparent trust. The system needs to make sure that your vote is securely and accurately counted, sure, but it also needs to be obvious to everyone, no matter their technical knowledge, that the system can be trusted. So if you're using paper, you place your ballot in a sealed box that doesn't get unsealed until everyone with a stake in the election has someone representing them in the room. There should always be people from more than one side guarding it, or at the very least, witnessing that there's a tamper-proof seal being used for transport. Voters need to be able to trust that their vote will be counted, even though they'll never see it again and it can't be traced back to them. And at no point is a single person put in a position of trust. People can be corrupt or threatened or incompetent or all three at the same time. Now, physical voting is not perfect. It can be attacked. It has been attacked. The UK's own paper system doesn't fulfill both of those requirements perfectly. It is possible to identify voters from their ballots if a court orders it. And there are stories about that being done outside the law too. But the key point is not that paper voting is perfect. It isn't. But attacks against it don't scale well. Physical voting is centuries old. And in that time, almost every conceivable fraud on the system has been tried and defences have been found. The more physical votes you need to change, the more people you need to influence, the more time and money it takes, and the less likely it is that your little conspiracy will stay secret. In the UK election, there are hundreds of polling stations across the country with staff made up of scores of employees and thousands of volunteers. The job of changing a significant number of votes enough to sway an election becomes very, very difficult. People have attempted it. Some people have been convicted. A few have probably gotten away with it on some scale. Granny farming is the term that shady operatives use for going around all the retirement homes and getting vulnerable elderly people to sign a proxy vote, a paper saying that someone else can vote on their behalf. And yeah, on a small scale, that has worked. But once you start scaling up that attack, it becomes extremely difficult and time consuming, and the chances are you're going to get found out. With electronic voting, that's not the case. So first, let's talk about electronic voting machines. That's where there's a computer at the polling station, so voters still go into a booth. It's just that they are pushing.
Okay, so that's the link, by the way, if you want to access it. It's on the notes that like you guys put copies of. Again, we won't go through the whole video, but the major points that he brings up is this thing about anonymity. Who you voted for cannot be known, who can't be influenced. Okay. And the big one that he talked about was trust. Now, the major thing about trust in a voting system is that things don't have to be broken to lose trust. They just have to be perceived to be broken to lose trust. So even, let's say, you have the most perfect electronic system on the face of the earth that lets you do and solve the scalability and accuracy problem, and it works perfectly, but people don't have an idea of how it works. They won't trust it. So it doesn't matter, like, if you can pound your desk as a technical person and say, this electronic voting is perfectly secure, nobody's ever going to hack it, it's going to work amazingly. If people don't trust in it, they won't trust in the democratic process. So there has to be transparency. People don't have to understand paper voting exactly, but they've got a sense of how it works. Okay. And so they've got the idea of, like, paper vote, it gets taped up, it gets transported somewhere, a bunch of people count it. That's how it works. And they have faith in that. I mean, it's not perfect. Boxes can be lost. People can try to stuff an individual box with ballots. As you said, the granny farming approach, that can also be used. But the major problem with that is what we term that scalability problem, okay, with paper voting, because it is really difficult to shift all the ballots on paper ballots, physical paper ballots, across an entire country. Can it be done? Yes. I'd suggest you look at North Korea and see how that operates. Apparently, the current president just got revoted with 100% of the vote. So he's doing something right. So it can be done, yes. But it is really, really difficult to do. Okay, and people may not completely know how a paper system works, but they know it's really difficult to get across everything. And so that provides a degree of faith. It's also difficult to attack. Paper is difficult. Now, are there advantages to electronic voting? Yes, it's easy. Okay, for the voter. Okay, it's not easy for public officials. Okay, why? Okay, here's the major thing. Let's say we provide a service that anyone can vote with their phone, right? Okay, so that means that not only are you going to have to support every single phone type that's around the entire country. Remember that thing I mentioned at the beginning about, like, as public officials, we have to serve everybody in the country? Think about that with voting. So you have to support every single freaking smartphone around the country. Okay, secondly, what about people without smartphones? I mean, we all know somebody that refuses to get a smartphone and may have a little brick phone. Get little brick phones. I remember, I totally had a little brick phone back in the day. Okay, so we're going to provide alternate services for them. Okay. But you've also got to, what happens if something goes wrong with everyone's phone that can do it on their phone? You got to support all the types, you got to troubleshoot all that kind of stuff. It gets really, really difficult to do that. And that's presuming that all the smartphones out there are secure. Okay. And even worse, that the central communication that the phone is connecting to is itself secure, and that the connection between the two is secure. Okay, so I would say one of the major things that, and this is when we talk about hardware and software, and that's the thing, you just need to cast enough doubt that e-voting has been corrupted, that something's happened. A classic example of this is in Florida, and I want to say 2020 election, and US presidential election. They used a weird kind of hybrid approach that was both digital and in person. So you turn up to a voting center, and just like you'll traditionally do when you go vote, but instead of filling out a paper vote, there was a touch screen. And you could select the things, and then that would send your vote off to the central counting zone. There was a whole bunch of conspiracy regarding those voting machines in that election. Multiple inquiries have been taken post the election to determine whether or not everything had worked the way in which it's supposed to. They had every single inquiry had said, yep, totally worked. a majority of the populace in Florida believed that it hadn't. And it cast major doubts on the result in Florida, and then flow-on effects to other areas of the country because of stuff. It was working fine. But there was enough doubt was cast on it that the entire legitimacy of the election got called into question. And so that's the context we got all this stuff. The trouble with anonymity also is that a lot of these, if you just say, okay, we've got a connection between a smartphone and a central counting facility. Okay, we'll make that encrypted. We're all used to a lot of the apps that we use are encrypted. WhatsApp is encrypted, Signal, et cetera, et cetera. Even iMessage on your Apple iPhones is all encrypted. But the thing is, what you then have to have a unique identifier at each end to make that encrypted. A unique identifier identifies you. That's the point behind it. Suddenly anonymity is broken. Okay? And so this is why e-voting isn't a question of the technology failing. Okay? E-voting is when you're in a situation as critical as a national election, the vulnerabilities and legitimacy of the system, again, looking at the social and cultural arrangements of which you're embedding in, means that I don't think e-voting will ever happen or be a good thing to do at the national level. Now, for less contingent voting, for where the stakes are not as high as that, yeah, this arrangement starts being less of a concern. Some of the local body elections here in New Zealand are fine with electronic voting. But most of the time paper works. I mean, that example I mentioned from Florida, people still, they couldn't do it from home. They couldn't do it on their phones. They had to turn up to a physical location and press a screen. At that point, I'm going, why don't you just have paper ballots? Because you're just going to turn. Now, it does speed up the counting of votes, which is not the worst thing on the face of the earth. But to be honest, you can solve that by just throwing more money at the problem and employing a few more vote counters. So this is why I use this as a classic example. Again, watch the video if you get that opportunity. It's actually really interesting. He goes into like a deep dive of why the stuff doesn't work in more detail than I'm giving. But this is a classic example of understanding the social context in which an ICT thing can occur. Okay, so, and this is what it gets to the thing. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Okay, what does e-voting provide to you that would solve a problem? What's the problem that e-voting would solve? Now, is it easier, as I mentioned earlier, is it easier to vote using your phone? Yes. Okay, but are there other ways that you could make it easier to vote? Okay, do you need to pre-enroll? Okay, why do we do that? Like, couldn't we do it at the same location? That makes it easier. Do we accept multiple forms of ID? Okay, if we're requiring ID in a voting place, how about we just expand the possibilities for ID or not need ID? We just maybe trust an individual that they're turning up and they say who they are. Believe it or not, that's how New Zealand voting works. I can rock up and just say, my name's Sarah Bickerton. And I can vote for Sarah Bickerton. And that's makes it as easy as possible. Okay, so that's one of the big things that I always ask when I'm looking at technology provision is like, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? So can this be done in other ways that don't introduce the problems that technology might cause? Now, it doesn't always prevent a technological solution. Sometimes things are really good to have a technological solution. Being able to submit on bills in Parliament, for instance. That's actually because not everyone can make their way to Wellington. Okay. Or might not be able to go to the postal service. I think one of the best things that you can do actually in America, in New Zealand, we always have our national voting day is always on a Saturday. It's always on a Saturday. Why might we have it on a Saturday? Sorry? It's a weekend. Yeah, most people, some people aren't, but most people are it's like off work. Okay, so we can go along. Okay. Actually having it on a weekend is a really good idea. What we've actually done in New Zealand is that we have weeks of early voting too, so you can just rock on up and vote before election day. It makes it nice and easy. US has most places don't have early voting, and do you know what day of the week their election day is always held on? Tuesday. Always on Tuesday. Tradition. Americans are really anal about tradition. And I'm not just saying that, having lived there for nearly a decade, they're really particular about tradition. You always do it on a Tuesday. But yeah. Anyway, so that's kind of like getting into that. Okay, so then there's smart cities. We've been talking about a lot of things around central government, okay? And like what central government do. But there's also another form of government. Local government. Okay, I often talk to my students about how it's like whenever they're getting into like public policy studies, they often have this idea of working in central government, getting down to Wellington or whatever like that. The cool thing about working in local government is a lot of the things that local government do about everyday activities and impacts on people. It's like by doing a lot of good work at the local government level, you can actually like really impact the everyday experience of people's lives. And smart cities kind of operate in this context. So what is a smart city? Okay, there's going to be a short video. Think about what the video includes or what the video leaves out. For those of you, it's situated in the local government in Wellington. I was actually living in Wellington when this got recorded, so it's a few years old now. But what do you think the core assumption of what a smart city is? Yes.
Wellington's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's New Zealand's capital, and we've developed a really good long-term strategy. To be a truly smart city, of course, we need to harness lots of modern technology. That can help us predict traffic flows and make the city a safer and more attractive place. It can reduce crime while respecting privacy. And to do all that, we need to use our resources wisely and partner with technology giants like NEC.
We developed a project that is around counting traffic flow, modal counting, and that's really important for us to not only assist with developing urban space for traffic flow, to make sure that we have a good program in place for renewals for roads. Another project, which is the Kite platform, and this allows us for flexible sensing, collection of data and information, which will allow us to be well placed for the future. We worked with NEC to develop smart technologies, the sensing for antisocial behaviour, identify incidences of these in real time. It provides us with a way that we can have instant responses to issues that arise. NEC's Cloud City Operating Centre provides us with the tools and the future focus of having an open source data that allows ourselves, our partners and citizens to benefit from sharing information and planning for the city.
Working with NEC has been a real pleasure. They've been adaptable and they've brought new technology to help us solve difficult problems of today's cities. It's really exciting to start seeing the results of our partnership with NEC. We include people, we improve the environment, and it's going to be a very successful, exciting digital economy.
Orchestrating a brighter world, NEC.
Okay, so major points for the video. Technology, unsurprisingly, throughout all of it, they're talking about what the technology can do, and it's like what it can provide to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Did you notice there was nothing particular about Wellington in there at all? It was just like Wellington's the location. Unsurprisingly, of course, because this video is an advertisement for NEC. Okay, so they're looking at the technology provision. As an aside, by the way, those interior office shops that they had in there, that was from the old Wellington City Council building, which is, we had a major earthquake in 2016 that is now completely gone, completely demolished. So I like looking at those like interior shots. I've been in that room, and it's kind of like, oh, I know this old building. It's now completely gone. Anyway, So leaving aside the fact that this was an advertisement about for NEC, they're leaning on the technology. It's nothing about Wellington, the particularity of Wellington. All these stuff that's talking about in terms of technology provision could be in any city. Okay. Predict traffic flows. Okay, so that's one of the things that I often find that get used. It actually can be quite useful. You'll see those little security cameras in a lot of intersectional locations, and they're measuring the amount of traffic's going through, where congestion's happening, both for future planning and also to deal with if congestion happens at a particular moment. Now, we do a lot of this where we predict traffic flows, or we may need to change the arrangement at the intersection to make it flow better and stuff like this. The one thing I often talk about that is that it will predict based upon current transportation arrangements. Okay, it allows you to predict how many cars you have going through an intersection. Doesn't tell you anything about, oh, what happens if we put like a bus lane through there, or how many cars would that remove, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't allow you to have any data for alternate arrangements. It just allows you to improve the current arrangement of transportation. So it says predict traffic flows, but it's more talking about it within the current context. If you change the context, the data kind of loses. So you need to understand the way in which the data operates. City can be more attractive. Yes, no. It's often that's talked about, like air pollution monitors. So like rainfall accumulation, that kind of stuff, where things are clean, where things are dirty, that kind of stuff. Predict crime while protecting privacy. That one popped up quite frequently, quite prominently, sorry. Did anybody notice what type of crime that they were using in that example? It went pretty quickly, so did anyone notice? They said antisocial behavior, right? Did you notice what the antisocial behavior was? Because they zoomed in on the person and said special assistance required. What it was a homeless person. Yeah. And that's one of the things that, like, but they're predicting crime. Homelessness isn't a crime. So that's like, as an aside, it's like crime data. Yes, it's like you're getting data about crimes, right? It's often referred to as crime data. Do you know what crime data actually measures? It doesn't measure crime, by the way. It measures arrests. Okay? Arrests versus crime are two different things. Okay? Because certain communities get over-policed, certain areas get over-policed. So they're over-represented, and so if you're using crime data to do predictions, you're basing predictions off biased arrangement. So understanding what's the data that's going on here is really crucial. Again, I know I'm harping on this point quite frequently, but understand the social context in which a lot of these technology stuff is operating, and particularly when you're dealing with data, understanding the nature of the data and what the data is actually measuring is really crucial. It's particularly important when we're dealing with public sector, because data may be measured, had a measurement of one thing in one government department, and it may have exactly the same label in another government department, but it may be measuring something else as an indicative measure of those kind of things. Okay, so understanding that data. Now, use resources wisely and partner with technology giants. I always love that one because they were particularly referring to NEC. It's one of the biggest technology companies in the world. Unfortunately, not long after this video was produced, NEC, they had a large headquarters here in New Zealand. They relocated to Australia and pulled out entirely out of the New Zealand market. So the entire system that they'd designed was no longer provided in New Zealand. So I often use this example because NEC is no longer in Wellington. So they're doing these kind of things, but the provision of it through a private sector company. Remember, Celia Way Brown, who was the mayor at the time, was talking about having a partnership with a technology giant. The trouble is, if you make government services dependent upon that partnership, and the private sector company isn't required to provide to the public, they can leave and go elsewhere. Okay, And so understanding those kind of partnership arrangements that maybe it might be better to have in-house solutions, that reduces the dependencies and the externalities of losing technology provision on the private sector. So yeah, that happened. Okay, so defining a smart city. There's a couple definitions here. A smart city is urban development vision to integrate information and communication technology, ICT, with Internet of Things, IoT. Basically, they're little sensors, everything from the little cameras at intersections and those kind of things to air quality monitors. Even simple things like, okay, so if you're pulling up on a car to a set of traffic lights, and you'll see often a little square cut into the asphalt that most people will recognize. Okay, that's a sensor that'll tell that the lights that a car is there. Does anybody know how those work? Okay, nope. Magnetically, yeah. It uses what's known as inductive circuits. You get a car or a piece of metal that's large enough, it'll go over the top of that. It creates an inductive current, small inductive current that gets measured, and they say that the car was there. I know this because I ride a motorcycle, and often my motorcycle isn't big enough to set off the inductive circuit, and so that's annoying. But those are the kind of Internet of Things stuff. They're not big, okay? They're just little things that do air quality monitoring, okay? Rainfall monitoring, all these kind of things. Smog detection, the amount of humidity in the air, all those kind of things. So it's like a smart city is promoted to use urban informatics and technology to improve the efficiency of services. Now, how this works is actually has some big effects. One thing you can also do is have like little water flow measurements in water pipes for like how much water is going into a particular area, and like there may be more demand in a particular space and that kind of stuff. Wellington particularly didn't have a large amount of water sensors. They had them in some of the sensors, but they had a very, very old piping network, like really old, that was going back into the 1800s. And in 2016, they had the massive Kaikoura earthquake, okay? And it damaged a goodly chunk of the city. I was living in Wellington at the time. It was a big ass earthquake. Now, I was working at the time at the Victoria University of Wellington, and just across the street from me, suddenly the intersection that was just across from my building, a massive sinkhole opened up in the middle of the intersection, and it was huge. It started off as a small hole, and then progressively through the rest of the day, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they had to close off the entire intersection. And what they found in Wellington was that they had water sensors at the reservoirs that were providing the city water, and they had a lot of sensors at people's homes, but they had figured out we're getting a lot more water going into the system at the reservoir, but not that much more coming out of the system at people's homes. But because they had no other sensors anywhere else in the network, or not much sensors else in the network, they couldn't determine where the leaks were happening post-earthquake. So that sinkhole happened completely unpredicted because there were no measurements that it had broken the water main under there. It was still functional, but it had cracked enough that it was putting out a lot of water, ate all the ground out from underneath it, and then it all collapsed. Those are the kind of things that really basic things like a water flow meter that is cheap and easy, but these are the kind of things that you can real-time monitoring, you can identify that kind of stuff. That hasn't been massively improved, by the way, in Wellington. They have some more and they're slowly replacing things, but hasn't been massively improved. Smart cities emerged in the US in the 1960s, used by the US Community Analysis Bureau. They used databases, aerial photography, and cluster analysis because this was before the internet. That happened. It led to the first generation of smart cities delivered by technology providers to understand the implications of technology on everyday life. The second generation of smart cities, that was when they were starting to join up different municipal services. Okay, so a lot of it was like pre-internet and doing mapping and understanding what a city looked like. Okay, how was it functioning? It's like where, like simple things were like putting a plane over at rush hour to look at where the congestion points are for traffic. That all came out of the 1960s and 70s, and it's turned into, again, this is the boring, banal stuff of measuring sewage pipes. Not exciting work, but this is where the basics of a lot of ICT happens, particularly if you want it to work well. And trust me, if sewage pipes fail, you're in the shit. We're now into third generation of smart cities, where the second gen and the NEC example was when this started. They were partnering with technology giants to provide private sector provision. What's happened in the third generation is that it's been moved a lot more in-house into governments because they've realized the reliance on private sector companies is kind of precarious. They took control away from technology providers and city leaders to one that involved the public, fostering inclusion and engagement. That little wee app that we use in I mentioned right at the beginning to identify little faults and that kind of stuff. That's where you really get into this kind of stuff of like everyday things that have real massive, because it's embedded in the social relationships that you're with. An example of this, New York City monitored sensors to detect elevated flow levels in sewer pipes, alert city staff to perform inspections, preventative maintenance, guide future infrastructure investment. A classic example of this was when they started putting these monitoring systems into the sewage system in New York. They discovered, oh my God, they knew that there were blockages happening, but they didn't know where the blockages were happening, what was causing the blockages. Then they started sending people down and setting these stuff up. Do you know where they discovered what the blockages were being mostly caused by? Fat. People were pouring, particularly from restaurants and stuff, used fat and oils down their sewage lines because they were disposing of it. They're pouring it down there. I mean, you wouldn't want to put fat or like liquid fat and stuff like this into your trash bags, so they're just pouring it down the sewage lines. And so what they discovered, they're like, oh my God, these were they had a term for them. They called them fatbergs, like an iceberg, but made out of fat. And it would clog things up. And so as a result of doing this kind of measuring in the early days of doing smart cities, they were able to initiate really boring things like a campaign to stop people pouring oil and fat down the drain. City of Chicago, for instance, installed in a pilot study, because 40 is not much, but they did a 40 sensor nodes installed on lampposts to collect data on weather, air quality, light intensity, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth devices within a 100-foot range. Now, in addition to the weather, air quality, and light intensity, it allowed them to, where there are wind tunnels being created between buildings. Okay, is there any way that, like, if someone's putting in a new building permit, can we require them, because this area is like a wind canyon, maybe we could get require them to put in backling to stop that kind of wind intensity happening. What they also did is that the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth devices. So what that was happening was that, like, your little smartphone, what it does is, unless you've got it completely locked down on both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, what it's constantly doing when you're walking around is going, hi, 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 and it's looking for other Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connections around it. That's what it just does. That's what it does all the time. It's like, that's the nature of it. You can shut it down. That's what it prevents. But so what they did is they put Wi-Fi and Bluetooth sensors. They wouldn't actually connect to your phone, but it would register how many devices that went by going, and they got a sense of pedestrian traffic flows. Where were people walking? Maybe they needed to increase the size of the footpath on that particular size to deal with large amounts of traffic flow at the particular moment. Maybe certain times of the day, because a certain crosswalk got used frequently, that they could make that change more often at rush hour when people were walking and stuff. And so these were the kind of, again, really boring things, but had really massive implications for these kind of small sensors. Now, This is what, there are some criticisms around smart. I like smart cities. They're great. They're just a really great use of like small pieces of technology that don't require much and you can just pick it up. This gets to the idea when you're measuring the status quo and you want to optimize that as much as possible, it can mean that you can lose thinking about like alternate ways of doing things. Okay. I mean, one of the things that people often talk about, like, oh, we can't make a certain street pedestrian only because that would cause massive congestion. Okay. So they said, no, we're not going to make a particular street pedestrian only. What they discovered actually is if you do make something pedestrian only, people get annoyed by the amount of congestion and stop driving and take public transportation and end up walking. Okay. A measurement of basic car traffic flows would not have done that. Okay. So understanding, like, still understanding the alternate avenues of promising urban development, that's the kind of stuff you've got to put that data into context. Smart city as a scientifically planned city. Yeah, okay, so here's the thing about measuring cities. Cities are organic. They're messy. They grow in particular ways. One part of the city is not like another part of the city. And so having a very set in stone, rigid idea about the way in which things operate, it doesn't work. The data can provide you an approximation, but it's not exact because cities are messy. Okay. The focus of the concept of a smart city may lead to an underestimation of the possible negative effects of the development of new technological and network infrastructures needed for a city to be smart. This is basically externalities. Okay. What might be the negative effects of using a tech? Okay. That great example about measuring pedestrian stuff in Chicago, the pilot ended and they didn't continue with it. Why? Because people perceived that they were being spied on, even though there was no connection actually happening with that little sensor. It was literally just counting the numbers of eyes that were going past it. It had really massive negative effects. Everybody thought they were being tracked. So they had to stop doing that. So technology does what it does do, but you need to understand it in the context. And this is the big one. As a globalized business model based on capital mobility, this basically means that technology giants will go wherever the money is. And so if you make your smart city provision dependent upon a particular technology partner, they may go elsewhere. Okay, there are a lot. Technology giants are a lot more mobile than governments are. Okay, so they may write their own deals in order to come to town, but they can just leave when they get a deal that they want to go elsewhere. Technology companies are really good at that. And also people, as I said, high level of big data collection. There's some ethical and privacy concerns that you really need to concern yourself with. And particularly as it relates to predictive policing, in terms of that example, people often use the phrase predictive policing, that they can look at crime data and identify where are the areas that they need to focus on. But again, when I'm talking about crime data, I'm talking about arrest data. So often those are the areas that police are in anyway. Okay. You need to understand the way in which the data operates. Okay, so talking about data, big question, big data. I mean, you've all heard this term big data because you've been working in this area for a while. What is it? I use the model by Douglas Laney, which is big data is an intersection of three different types. Although it might use just two of them, but volume. In other words, big data, shockingly, there's a lot of it. Okay. Velocity, it's coming at you in real time. Okay, so it's high speed, it's all the time. And variety, the form in which it's arriving is really in a lot of different forms. So when you're dealing with anyone that's in an ICT project that's dealing with big data, these kind of concerns are the things that you're dealing with. You need large amount of storage to be able to deal with it. You're going to be operating in real time. Even if it's not real time, it'll be regular updates coming into you, like on a daily or hourly basis and that kind of stuff. And it'll have multiple forms. And so a lot of big data projects, this is the particular context in which we're operating in. And it's getting much bigger, more rapid, and more varied. Okay, that's the nature of big data. I know that everyone nowadays talks about AI. AI is the current buzzword, it's been everywhere, blah, 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 blah. AI is incredibly dependent on this. Okay, so when you're understanding AI, and a lot of us that work in this field, we do, and so you need to understand the way in which the technology operates, but you also need to understand the stuff that it uses in order to function. That's why I know about home data, and understand the way in which it operates. More data being generated in the world, and even more in the future as people's lives become more digital. Okay, more photos have been taken since the invention of the smartphone than existed in all of history before the smartphone. Okay, and that's just smartphone, and that's just photos. Like, there is so much more about the data that we're submitting that is now, it's like we have got way more. Smartphones, devices with image recognition, analytics software, sensors, information of things that I just talked about earlier, all this kind of stuff goes into this arrangement. Now, what there also is that we talked about earlier about government departments each having their own data collection and trouble getting them to talk to each other. That's another level entirely on this. So each government department will be collecting information about people that it's servicing, helping them out, needing the information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What the next level of this kind of stuff is getting that data to talk to each other between different department and ministries. And that's called synthesized data. Okay? So when we're dealing with big data at this level, it's more than just like the spreadsheet or the output that you get through a report that gets run every morning or something like that. It's about getting these data sets to talk to each other, and with all the positive and negative outputs of that kind of thing. So, thinking about big data, what matters most is how you use it. Okay, it's not just about the data itself, although that is, of course, a concern, but what are you doing with it? Like, if you're collecting data, okay, great, but what are you going to do with it? Like, what does it tell you? Like, what do you think you can use it for? And this is what I'm talking about profoundly, this synthesized data that is core to big data. That's the varied types of data that's coming in there. It's profoundly different from traditional, what's we term aggregated data, where you brought it in from different sources and you put it together. This is coming from different sources, synthesized, able to be happening simultaneously in real time, and then giving you a picture at that kind of level. So traditional aggregated data took quite a bit of time to process. We bring in multiple data sets, put it together, figure out what the unique identifiers are, producing an aggregate output. That's slow. Okay, that's traditional data. Big data in the modern synthesized sense is real-time, high-speed, multiple sources, and that is huge. That's why modern data centers require so much power. Forgetting AI data centers, but modern just traditional data centers require so much power because that's what they're operating at. They're also operating at population levels. Okay, this isn't about like your community. This is data that's operating across the entire country. It's not a sample. Okay, a sample is when we're doing data, it's something that you pick as a representative, so it's a small amount of data. It can predict stuff about the wider population. That's a sample data. This is data that operates across everything. Okay, and it's as I mentioned, it's in a constant state of flow. Okay, this is one of the funny things the ironic things. Big data is small because even though the data set's huge, you require large data centers to do it. Each of the little bits of information is something small. Okay, your name, your age, your hair color, your weight, all these kind of things. It's like what's your highest degree level? What grades did you get? It's like what was your arrest record? What was like all these small little things. Okay, so when I say I like that as kind of like a little snappy statement. and it's trite a little bit, but it speaks to the way in which big data operates. It's not, this tells you, it's like, it has everything about, but it has all those little bits of information about it. Okay? User often involves integration of data sets, verification, does the integration of the data sets work correctly, and understanding the nature of the sets. Okay, a set is like not just the individual data points, but the whole thing is a connection. I mentioned this with some of the other groups that you can have an identifier, a particular piece of identifier within a data set that's an identifier for unique cases, and understanding if something with the same name in a different data set is measuring the same thing. And then you're able to use those to bring them together, but verify that they're actually measuring the same thing. Okay. And because each government department does things differently, that involves a lot of work. In government, this tends to involve sharing between departments, ministries, and often with the private sector. We're doing this a lot, that a lot of our data center provision in New Zealand is being given over to private sector. Microsoft and Google are two of the biggest players. Amazon's also coming in a little bit. We've had to, in provision for data, contract provision for data centers in New Zealand, we've had to put a line in the contract that says that you can't use the data for AI. Because Google would have, oh my God, we've got a massive data set from everybody in New Zealand. And so we've had to put that contract line in there to prevent them from doing it. It's not democratic. Okay. This is what we term a technocratic tool. In other words, technocratic or technocracy and doesn't refer to the technology. It means rule by experts. That's the original Latin background. Basically means it's a tool for bureaucrats. Okay? It's not something that the public uses. Okay? So knowing everything about a community and making decisions based on data, good. You want to do that. You want to have an informed decision, right? But the thing is, you making a decision for a community based on data isn't a democratic decision. Okay, you haven't involved the public in that. Yeah, yeah.
What's an example of big data?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm actually going to be. No, great question. I am actually going to use an example of that, and I'll get to it in a moment. Yeah. We have a Stats NZ, New Zealand Statistics. They're down in Wellington. They run what's called the IDI, or what is known as the Integrated Data Infrastructure. And they have pull in data from all government, not all, but a large amount of government departments and ministries to create this kind of big data arrangement. So police, immigration, the tax department, the census, all those kind of stuff, and that's like, and then a whole bunch of other ones as well, Ministry of Economic Development, all that kind of stuff, and it all gets centralized and stuff. Now, I'll get into it in a little bit, but there's massive protections around that. You can't just log onto the IDI versus through your laptop. It's like hard physical Ethernet connections a little bit, and certain locations that are encrypted and stuff like that. But I'll get to that in a moment. But great question. So again, how is it going to be used? When and where are you going to use it? How it's used is often dependent on how the data is thought about. But that idea about what crime data actually measures, like what do you think about what it is? Provides information on what and often how, but it doesn't get to why. Okay, so because people, like for instance, if you're ever doing a survey on people's attitudes towards things, just a really basic survey, and you get people think this, okay, and that's great. People think this, but do you have enough information on why people think that? So people might think the same thing, but come to it from very different perspectives. So, and a lot of this data measures what and how, but it often doesn't get to why. Okay. And then of course, this is what I'm talking about earlier, understanding what the limits of data and what it's measuring, what gets missed. Okay? It's like, what is it not telling you? Yeah. An example of this was the social development data collection. Previous national governments proposed that all contracts with NGOs, not-for-profits or service providers would require in the contract, if they wanted funding, that that client data from NGOs will be provided back to the government. The reason for that, the reason that they wanted to do it was their argument was, and I misspelled argument, that sucks, was for the collection of data to better, you tell I write my own slides, I misspelled it, better assess outcomes and planning provisions. Basically, the government wanted it, so they said, hey, what are the successful programs? And so we can provide more funding for those kind of things. The NGOs refused to go along with it. Why? Because a lot of the NGOs are operating with vulnerable customers. And if they thought that their data was being collected, they wouldn't go to those services because they didn't want their data collected. They're often vulnerable people. They might be had existing like negative interactions with the law and stuff like this. The idea that their client data would be given by the NGO without their say-so to government because the government was requiring funding, the NGOs refused to it. Even the Privacy Commissioner, in New Zealand we have a Privacy Commission, challenged this because he said this is just going to have massive negative ramifications, particularly if data gets leaked. And the government at the time said, oh, don't worry about it. Things are massively secure. Nobody's data is ever going to be leaked. And literally, I shit you not, a week later, Ministry of Social Development had a severe breach of the data systems, and a whole bunch of vulnerable people's information came out. And then suddenly this requirement went away. Okay. I'm not going to say the government at the time was being nefarious about this. They literally just wanted a way to measure what success was happening, what was working, what was not working, so they could better distribute funds. Okay. But simple things about data and the way in which it gets used has massive negative ramifications. It pretty much would have meant that all these NGOs just wouldn't have been able to service what they were doing. Okay, so there are benefits, okay, to having all this data, and we do have it with the IDI in New Zealand. Competitive advantage, business opportunities, better public services, better places to live and work and play. So it's not that like you should walk away from big data. It's not all negative. It does provide a lot of benefits to you, but it's about understanding this and dealing with it again, getting to that banal stuff right from the beginning. What's it embedded in? What's the negative ramifications? That thing that I talked about post and overpay about like planning things out. This is whenever you're looking at this, particularly if you're partnering with private sector providers, they will be talking about this kind of stuff. What you need to do as public service people, when you're involved with the planning of this, is to put this into the social context and start thinking about what might be the ramifications of it. Yeah, there are really cool things that you can do with this, but understanding the limits of it is the important thing. That one is work in progress. Okay, so the challenges: invasion of privacy. Okay, invasive use where individuals are targeted can be annoying, but can actually be quite harmful. Okay, discrimination and exclusion from services based on correct or incorrect information. Things that might be good for you, but you don't have access to it because of actually correct stuff. Okay. Malicious use for criminal purposes, including identity theft and fraud. This has happened. Big Brother. Where's the line between a legitimate state power and individual liberty is crossed? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to or should do. And that's understanding. That's when I was talking about like something being a democratic decision versus being a technocratic decision. Okay, it's like you could do something and make a unilateral decision for a community based upon all the data that you've got. You're making an informed decision and stuff like this. But is that a good use of state power? Algorithms. Anybody know what you've all heard of the word algorithm? Anybody know what the word algorithm actually refers to? Yeah, no, actually, you're remarkably close with that hand movement. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically what it is, it's at its core, it's the word actually predates computers. And basically it's a series of, it's called decision trees. If then you make a choice. If this, then you make a choice. And traditional generative AI does something different. So we'll put that to the side. But most computer systems nowadays use algorithms. And algorithms are designed by human beings to make a series of decision trees. Okay, so it's not just the data you're putting into the system; it's the decision points that you've made. That those are the points where a decision needs to make for the system to make a choice. Like what's the cutoff for height? Okay, so like what's the cutoff for age for a particular service? Okay, these are all decision points that can be an algorithm, and your computer will spit out a certain number of people that might be eligible for a particular service. But then you're asking yourself, okay, what was the cutoff that the system had been set for in certain age, income requirement, et cetera, marital status. Okay, so the IDI. This is integrated data infrastructure. This is what's happened. This is down in Wellington. It's largely located. As I said, in order to get access to the IDI, you need to actually physically go to a location. There is one location in Auckland, and that's the Public Policy Institute. Upstairs, the Public Policy Institute, there is literally a room with a whole bunch of physical computers that are hardwired connected into the service down in Wellington. And you have to have swipe card access to get into there, and you have to have approved login to get into it and have access to it. So it's actually really, really tight. If you want to read a little bit more about it, go to that website down below. It'll give you a bit more information. This is the way in which it operates. So this is a good example. It takes housing data, justice data, health data, population data, that's the census and that kind of stuff, benefits and social services data, income and work data, that's the IRS, education and trading data, that's the Ministry of Education, people and communities data, okay? And what they do is now, each of these data sets are different, okay? So what StatsNZ have done is create unique identifiers to bring those all together. Okay. Some of this stuff is like daily or weekly or for a census every few years. Other is immediate. Your work income and work data is every single time you get paid. Okay. And a research database containing de-identified microdata. So microdata is what I was talking earlier about being small. De-identified means that it's very difficult. I won't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to link any one particular thing back to you. Okay. What they'll do is that instead of having your name as being the common identifier, what they'll have is just a simple ID number. And all the different organizations go through that way, having a unique identifier. And that's how the information gets integrated. So here's a
We all want to live in a country where everyone thrives, where children are healthy, safe, and doing well at school, where families are doing well, people of all ages have good health outcomes, and crime is prevented, where business is thriving, people have the skills they need to get a job, and people who move to New Zealand have a good experience. These are the sorts of things that many government services are responsible for delivering. But to be effective, government agencies need to understand what works and what doesn't, and where different approaches or more investment needs to be made. Understanding what works and what doesn't requires having good information. Information drawn from a range of organisations and sectors, and importantly, information that can be connected. Statistics New Zealand uses information gathered by organisations that provide all kinds of services to the New Zealand public. Combining all that information through data integration provides valuable insights that help improve our lives and economy. The ability to look at how services are delivered to New Zealanders across a range of agencies means those services are able to see where improvements are needed and ensure investment is made where it matters most. Ultimately, it's about the ability to assess the effectiveness of public services and ensure government programs are delivering value to New Zealand. Integrating data is particularly useful to help address difficult social issues like vulnerable children and crime. By integrating data, Statistics New Zealand is changing the landscape when it comes to delivering more effective services to New Zealanders. The data is gathered and all personal information removed. It's never about you as an individual, it's about us as New Zealanders. Statistics New Zealand is committed to ensuring the privacy, security, and confidentiality of all the information we hold. The information is anonymised. Personal identifying information like names and addresses are removed. Research reports and findings are anonymised and presented in a way which makes it impossible to identify individual people. Integrated data can only be accessed by approved researchers who must undergo a stringent vetting process. All research undertaken can only ever be for the public good. Here's a couple of examples of how integrating data can improve all our lives. Tertiary education is a big deal. It's one of those pivotal moments in a young person's life as they decide about their future. Choosing what courses to take and where, when there's a confusing array of study options available, can be daunting. But through integrated data, students can see for themselves what income and employment opportunities they're likely to get from a particular area of study. Combining data from education providers, IRD and immigration, an online tool has been created that lets students see what their chances of employment are and how much they're likely to earn. Our most disadvantaged people usually come into contact with more than one government service. But in the past, we haven't been able to coordinate services for people and see the whole person. By linking up government services, we can ensure no one falls through the net. And doing this is not just good for the individual, it benefits everyone. It means taxes are spent wisely and the government can tackle the difficult social problems like crime and vulnerable children more effectively. Finding answers for difficult questions like, what happens to older workers if they get injured? What happens to students after they graduate? Are they working? Do home visits make a difference to children's health and safety? And apprenticeships, what's working? Which regional economies need revitalising? Or how is life in New Zealand for new migrants? That's the power of integrated data, the ability to see patterns, identify what's working, what's not, and for whom. And all done safely with privacy and confidentiality staying at the heart of everything Statistics New Zealand does with information. Integrated data, better lives.
Now, of course, this is a promotional video, so it's talking about all the positives of it. That's the thing you're thinking about. What types of benefits and opportunities should we be aiming for? How can we make it easy to share and use data when it's required? Because it's one thing to have the data, but you guys as a public service, being able to use it when you need it, that's important too. But also, what's the risks and challenges that need to be managed and that kind of stuff? Again, getting back to the point I really started with at the beginning, this is about understanding like the really banal stuff. Are there privacy-friendly ways to access and use data? Okay. It's like, because this is really useful stuff. You can actually do genuinely good things. Like, I think one thing would be, it's like in New Zealand, when you get a job, often in the teens, when the first time you get a job, you apply for an IRD number. Okay. What happens if we identify with the fact that certain cohorts of people are getting to a certain age where they might be working? How about we say, okay, we'll start issuing IRD numbers beforehand. So people don't have to wait. They'll just go on, log on and say, hey, I've started working it. Oh, my IRD number is provided to me. Boom, done. What happens if, the same thing when you start university, it's like you have to apply for student ID number, student loan information, all this kind of stuff. How about if we set those systems up beforehand so the student didn't have to spend weeks or longer trying to get it all set up for them beforehand? If they passed their high school exams correctly, and it's likely that they're going to the university, going to a tertiary provider of some kind, how about we start setting that up beforehand? How about when someone gets pregnant and they're going to their doctor or anything like this, that you start providing all the information that their baby's going to need, the services providing that stuff, rather than getting to the hospital and then having to do that everything up after giving birth. Anyone that's given birth in this room know that there's a lot of paperwork after your baby after you give birth. So those are kind of things that, like, I know I'm talking about the negative ramifications of this kind of stuff. There is actually really positive things that you can do for people and how it can protect the interests of New Zealand and New Zealanders. What does data sharing look like? Then there's, of course, data sovereignty. Okay. Data sovereignty typically refers to the understanding that data is subject to the laws of the nation within which it's stored. I mentioned earlier about Google, Amazon, and Microsoft providing data storage, having those kind of data sovereignty contracts, requirements. But then there's also indigenous data sovereignty. Okay. Perceived data is subject to the laws of the nation from which it is collected. Okay. So understand the communities and their different approaches to what they consider ownership. Because what we're talking about so far is data collected about the whole population. And the trouble is, or the good thing is, our population has many diverse communities with different conceptions about what is considered ownership and what's about them. What does that data then get used about data about me or about my community or my ethnic group? What is that then used for? Okay, don't we get a say in that? And where it's stored, what it's used for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is actually one of the areas that is like sparking the most interest in a lot of work at the moment. Because, like it or not, we've come from a traditionally Western idea, particularly here in New Zealand, where people like me have data that is provided and shared that matches the way in which we conceptualize ownership, information, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the only way to do things. And so having different ways of thinking about data and what it gets used for and how it gets used, simple things like aerial data or satellite data or particular areas that might be coupled, for instance. What does that get used for? It's like who gets a say in what gets used for, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of Māori data sovereignty, recognize that Māori data should be subject to Māori governance. Māori data sovereignty supports tribal sovereignty, realization of Māori and iwi. Aspirations. If you go onto the Māori Data Sovereignty Network at that URL, they've got a whole ton of interesting resources there about different ways of thinking about using data and how it's like can empower groups rather than being used for. Okay. Okay. So finishing up today before we go on to the last activity. Technology is part of all policy solutions and modern policy space. It always is, okay? Even if it's not a flashy ICT project, it is part of everything. It tends to be status quo orientated. This is one of the things that alternate ways of doing things, different ways of doing things, don't necessarily come out of technology. It's about thinking in a different way, and then maybe a technology solution might be different for you. Ask very carefully about the particularities of data, the tools that you're using, what the measures involve, et cetera, et cetera. What it can be beneficial, okay? There's a lot of advantages here, but really you be critically aware of like what's embedded and what might be the consequences. Again, getting back to that question I mentioned earlier, what are you trying to solve? What's the problem? Okay. And what might be the negative effects? Even if everything goes perfectly swimmingly, what's the negative effects that you may need to control for this pipeline? Okay. That study I mentioned in Chicago about using the measurement, they got really great data. It did everything that it was supposed to do, but it didn't get continued because of the negative effects about government trust that were occurring. So it was a perfect project that didn't get continued. Okay. So you guys were talking about the examples that we're talking about. For the last 15 minutes, what was the exact problem you were solving? And I want you guys to think of something different. What might have been non-technological solutions to the problem that you identified right at the beginning? Now, there may not be, okay? Sometimes they may have them, may not be. But just do some blue sky thinking. It might be an alternate way of doing it, okay? So let's spend 15 minutes doing that, and then we'll wrap up today. We're about 5 minutes over. Thank you for being like such a discussing group and enjoying yourselves. Hopefully that wasn't too dull and boring. But I hope you guys enjoy this. We've got another week next week, if I remember correctly. Get out and enjoy Auckland and New Zealand a little bit over the weekend if you can. While it's sticky like this. But I hope you have an amazing time and you learn a lot by the end of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.